Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics, and in this video we are going to be comparing a sponge filter versus an internal canister filter. They have a lot of similarities, but there are some important differences that we need to understand before you make that choice. Appreciate you being here, and I hope you enjoy the video. All right, so when it comes to the two different types of filters, they have a lot in common. This is a sponge filter. We have many of these throughout our fish room in many different types of sizes. This happens to be one that's on the smaller side. This would probably be good for, like, let's say a 10-gallon tank. We also have some internal canister filters running in our fish room, and we're going to talk about why that is. But as I already mentioned, they have a lot in common. The first thing is there isn't a lot of equipment outside of the fish tank when you use either the sponge filter or the internal canister filter. In fact, for the sponge filter, the only thing that you would have is an air pump somewhere around the tank, and for the internal canister filter, that's pretty much it. You've just got the cord and everything else is inside the tank. So there is an advantage to having these types of filters. For both of them, you don't have anything really going on outside the tank, which can make the outside of the tank a little bit cleaner. The other big advantage of both types of filtration, because both filters are completely in the tank, there really isn't a lot of risk of having the filter cause water to flow outside of the tank. And that's pretty much the case for most other types of filters, sumps, canister filters, hang-on back filters, because they are all designed to pull water out of the tank, pull it through the filter, and then return it back into the tank. There is always a risk of having water wind up on your floor. For both the sponge filter and the internal canister filter, that risk is very much minimized. Now, they both have an inherent disadvantage, and that is they are both going to take up space inside the tank. And for some people, they may look unsightly. So whether you're using a sponge filter or the internal canister filter, you are taking up space inside the tank, and you're going to have to think about that, especially when you're going to be doing your aquascaping and adding in your fish tank decorations. Okay, so now that we know what they have in common, let's talk about some of the differences. I think the main thing that we want to address, of course, these are filters, we want to address how are they going to do regarding filtering your fish tank. Both of them, whether we're dealing with a sponge filter or an internal canister filter, are going to be more than sufficient to handle the biological filtration of your fish tank. In other words, they're going to supply surface area that allows beneficial bacteria to grow on the media, and that beneficial bacteria will convert the ammonia that's produced by the fish into nitrite, and then eventually that nitrite will be converted to nitrate. That's part of the nitrogen cycle. Both filters are going to do that more than sufficiently. Where there's a difference is when it comes to mechanical filtration and chemical filtration. The sponge filter here does an okay job of mechanical filtration, of pulling particulate matter out of the water column and getting it trapped in the filter so that your water appears clear. However, the internal canister filter does a much better job of mechanical filtration, and in fact, it's one of the reasons why we have them on the few tanks in which they reside. We have some problems with a little bit of particulate matter getting in the water, and so we wanted to clear that up a little bit. So the internal canister filter was added to pull more of that stuff out of the water column, making the water appear clear. So the definite advantage for mechanical filtration goes to the internal canister filter. When it comes to chemical filtration, here, this again is where the internal canister filter has a big advantage. For the most part, our sponge filters are just sponge. And so we don't really have an opportunity to add carbon or purigen or anything else that you'd like to add that may be able to neutralize some of the chemicals in the water. An internal canister filter often has a compartment that will allow you to do that. So for instance, if we take our canister filter apart, what we're going to see on the inside is there's going to be a filter cartridge. Now, inside of this filter cartridge is a place for us to add different types of media, whether that's bioballs, ceramic rings, purigen in a bag, activated carbon, all of that can be added here. So there is an advantage that we can do chemical filtration in one of these internal canister filters. So overall, I would have to give the advantage to the internal canister filter when it comes to accomplishing all three types of filtration The internal canister filter is going to do a much better job of mechanical and chemical filtration. Both are going to be equal when it comes to biological filtration. The other thing to consider is water flow. The two types of filters are going to have different water currents inside the tank. For the most part, the way that sponge filters are designed is there's going to be air that's pumped into the sponge filter, and then the bubbles are going to come out out of the top of the sponge filter. For an internal canister filter, what's kind of interesting about it is as it's sucking in water, it's actually blowing the water to the other side of the tank. And so when it comes to the water flow, it's going to be different. But I think what's going to happen is you're going to get better water circulation with an internal canister filter, because as it's sucking in the water in one end of the tank, it's blowing that water out of the return towards the other end. And so you wind up getting more water circulation with the internal canister filter, which is another reason why the mechanical aspects of filtration is going to be better with the internal canister filter. Now, when it comes to maintenance, they're both relatively easy to maintain. The sponge filter, you can simply take this out. In fact, we did a video on how to clean sponge filters. I'm going to put that in the upper right-hand corner, as well as in the description below, as well as a more thorough video about sponge filters. But this thing you just pull out of the tank, you rinse it out, make sure you squeeze out all the brown water, put it back in, done. The internal canister filter might be slightly more cumbersome because you have to detach the compartment from the power head, and that's all happening inside the tank, but it's still relatively easy to maintain because this thing could just be pulled out. You can take the filter floss off, rinse it off, or if you're going to be using your own filter floss, which is what I highly recommend, we've done a video on that. Again, I'll put that in the description below. You can just change it out, put the thing back together inside the tank, and you're ready to go. So both of them are relatively easy to maintain. However, I would give a slight advantage to the sponge filter when it comes to maintenance. Another thing to consider is if you're breeding fish, the sponge filter is probably the safest type of filter that you could possibly use. The sponge filter is not going to be sucking up fry, making it dangerous for your fish. The internal canister filter, on the other hand, does have these intake holes right here. There is a possibility that some fry can get sucked up here, and it would be a little bit harder to block this from happening compared to a sponge filter where there is relatively low risk. But again, I think there is a relatively low risk for the internal canister filter, but the risk is there. So what about longevity and reliability? Well, here I think is where the sponge filter might get the advantage. This is just sponge, and as long as your air pump is reliable, this thing is just going to keep on running. And usually these sponges will last at least 5, 6, 7 years before you have to replace them, and they're relatively cheap to replace. The internal canister filter, such as this, again, they have been relatively reliable for us, but if I had to give an advantage to one, I think the sponge filter might be a little bit more reliable and last a little bit longer than most internal canister filters. Now that brings us to the next point, and that is the cost. The cost really depends on your needs and on your situation. I think if you're running a smaller tank, like let's say less than 29 gallons, you may actually find that the cost is relatively the same, because with a sponge filter, and the sponge filters, depending on the size, might run you anywhere from, let's say, $4 to $9 just for the filter. But you're also going to need an air pump and an air line. And when you add in those costs, you might start approaching somewhere around $20 to $25 for that single sponge filter. Well, guess what? For a smaller tank, for some of the internal canister filters, you can pay right about the same money. Now, as you get into the larger setups, like let's say 55 gallons and above, maybe you're going to run a couple sponge filters with a single air pump. That's where you start to see a little bit of a cost advantage, because maybe you're spending $8 a piece for a sponge filter and maybe another $20 or so for a really good air pump that's got an adjustable flow. At that point, you're probably going to spend a little bit less money on the sponge filters compared to the internal canister filter, because now these things start running up to $40, $50, $60 depending on the size and the brand. Now, I think the big advantage to running sponge filters is when you have a setup such as ours and you're running lots of tanks or multiple tanks. We simply don't have enough power capacity in our fish room to run internal canister filters on every single tank. It's much more cost efficient to run a single large air pump and have that one pump power multiple sponge filters, as you see in our fish room, rather than trying to run the power and consuming all that power for an internal canister filter. So that is the big advantage of sponge filters, because they do a very good job of biological filtration and an adequate job of mechanical filtration. This is the way to go when you've got multiple tanks. Now, if you're interested in using internal canister filters like the ones we use the Penplex internal canister filters as well as the Marinelands. I will put the affiliate links down in the description below if you want to check them out, maybe try something different. If there's a downside to the internal canister filter that maybe the sponge filters don't have, and that is these things are usually attached to the glass via suction cups. Depending on your situation, that may work out okay. Sometimes the suction cups will dislodge from the internal canister filter or come apart from the glass, in which case you have to re-stick them on there, but it's just not something you have to worry about with a sponge filter. And finally, we have the looks. That's really a personal preference thing. I do think it's a little bit easier to hide a sponge filter in most aquascapes compared to an internal canister filter, but they're both in the tank, they're both taking up space, and really it just comes down to what you prefer. All right, everyone, so that was a quick rundown of the differences between a sponge filter and a canister filter. If you want to learn a lot more about sponge filters, check out this video in the upper right-hand corner. If you want to learn how we clean sponge filters, this video in the lower right-hand corner will help you do that. Appreciate you being here, and if you enjoyed this video, share, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. All of our tanks have sponge preference thing.